And thank you to the organizers for inviting me and bringing me here to Brussels. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to start out this morning with a story. And the story is one that comes from the book that I published recently. And it begins once upon a time. So, once upon a time, a large, very poor, but resource-rich country, just emerging from a period of intense conflict, decided to focus on development. We need to modernize our infrastructure, they said. We need to develop our energy and our ports. And soon they had a visit from a wealthy Asian country that had already become a major consumer of their resources. And this Asian country said to them, "We will make you a bargain. We will give you a line of credit worth $10 billion. And you can use that credit to import our technologies. Our companies can help you develop your infrastructure. And you can repay us with your resources." So many in this poor country were very suspicious of this Asian power. And it took a long time to negotiate this deal. But eventually the work began. Now, do you know which two countries I'm talking about? Okay, you're all laughing because you're thinking, of course you do. It's obvious. Well, of course, one of the countries was China. Yeah. China was the large, poor country with the natural resources. And the other country was Japan. And the time was more than 30 years ago, when China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. And when Deng Xiaoping and the Japanese made this bargain, it was very controversial in China, because people said, why get a loan, a big loan from Japan? Why send our oil and our coal to Japan? But they did make this bargain, and it was helpful for China's development. Now, there are several things about this bargain and the story that are relevant today. The first thing is, how many of you knew that story? Were you surprised? It's one of many surprises, if you were surprised, that I think you will find in my book, which looks at a lot of the conventional wisdom and the things that we think we know about China and Africa, and tries to present them in a new way, in a different way, and tries to make you think about it. But there are several things about that deal that are relevant for discussing China and the DRC. And the first is that this was not about foreign aid. This deal between China and Japan was a market-based commercial deal. But the second thing is that China saw that China could leverage and use Japan's interest. Japan was interested in China's markets. Japan was interested in business for Japanese companies. Japan was interested in exporting to China, and that China could afford to buy those exports. And China used that interest and leveraged it for China's own development. Now, we hear, I'm hearing about the deal in the Congo that we're going to be talking about today. This, what was originally a $9 billion deal and became smaller. The Financial Times wrote, "Beijing has thrown down its most direct challenge yet to the West's architecture for aiding Africa's development." And I think he was right. And in part, this challenge is because what China is largely doing in Africa is not about aid. That's why it challenges our aid architecture, because they are using different instruments. It's about business. Now, I've been working on China in Africa for almost 30 years. I first went to sub-Saharan Africa in 1983 as a student to study China. And that was after spending years trying to learn Chinese and living in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So at that point in 1983, I was kind of alone. There was almost nobody else in the world that was interested in this topic, and you can see things have changed. So when I started reading about China in Africa in the press, I was alarmed because I thought, this is being presented with a slant, and most of the time it's very negative. And certainly there are problems, and I will come to that. But in The Economist, they described China as the new colonialist, and there was a cover story about that. We hear that China is a rogue donor and that their aid is toxic. We hear they're leading the land grab in Africa. They give billions in aid to Sudan and Zimbabwe. They bring in all their own workers, or they give aid to get access to resources. And actually, there's very little truth to any of those, and I'll explain some of them, and I'm happy to answer others in the Q&A. Now, there are two big contrasts between China and the West. The West believes that Africa needs aid in order to develop, and they need good governance before they can develop. Aid can lead to development if it's given conditional on governance improvement. So governance comes first, and then development comes. And China believes that countries need investment and infrastructure to develop. They think aid is mainly about diplomacy and soft power. And they believe that governance improves as the economy develops. So these are very different frameworks about development. And it's why the Chinese are much more comfortable operating in countries with poor governance. They have a very long-term view. China does present a challenge. The environmental and social standards for Chinese companies are weak, just as they are in China. Chinese companies seem to be more willing to pay bribes and give kickbacks because they're not as constrained by domestic laws about making foreign bribery a crime. They pay low wages. Amongst multinational companies, usually the Chinese wages are the lowest, and their safety standards are usually the poorest. But they're about at the level of many of their counterparts in Africa. Chinese immigrants and traders are creating challenges for African workers and traders because they haven't had this kind of competition. Certainly from the Europeans, they were not competing at the level of the marketplace and the small shops. Many times there are complaints about goods coming in from China, substandard or counterfeit, and I even hear these complaints from Chinese manufacturers. They say, my own products are being counterfeited by other Chinese companies. And they are willing to partner with any government in Africa that grants Beijing diplomatic ties. So Zimbabwe and Sudan. So these are very real issues. But I think that our focus on these issues obscures many of the other aspects of China's engagement. And here are a few examples that I hear when I go around Africa. The immigrants, the Chinese exports that are creating competition, Chinese workers. And here, I don't know if you could see this, but it's a picture of me interviewing a small Chinese shopkeeper who's selling hair pieces. But perhaps the biggest challenge is something different, something we don't read about as much. And the challenge is this, that aid from the West has not been very successful in raising living standards or stimulating structural transformation of African economies. And I think that's because our aid has been very systematically de-linked from investment and manufacturing and job creation. Right now, my country, the United States, most of our aid to Africa is going into health, which is an important sector, but it's disproportionately being supported. And in health, we're not even supporting the most important diseases. We're putting most of our money into HIV/AIDS, which is important. And there's no mistake about that. But in Africa, malaria kills more people than HIV/AIDS. So we have our aid is not necessarily going to the things that are prioritized by Africans. Another point is that Africa, by and large, in most countries, are rich in terms of resources and assets. These are rich places that export their wealth. We haven't figured out a way in the West to link Africa's riches to its development and bring those together. Now, the Chinese are actively trying to do just this. The riches and the development, and bring them together. And they're not doing that out of altruism. They're not doing that because they want to be nice. They're doing that because it makes sense for them, business-wise. So it works. It's mutual benefit. Let me give you an example from Niger. The Chinese ambassador there was being interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And he said, look, the French have been here for decades. This country has already seen uranium extraction for nearly 40 years by the French. But when one sees that the direct revenues from uranium are more or less equivalent to those derived from the export of onions every year, there's a problem. And he said, we can do better than that. So it was a direct challenge. Now, I want to talk about two myths first. And my book is focused, first of all, on foreign aid, but beyond that, I look at all of the instruments of economic engagement used by the Chinese government in Africa. But we'll look briefly at aid. So the first myth is that China is new, or a new donor in Africa, a new actor. Now, this comes from my research over the last 30 years. And what it is a map of several things. Along the top goes in 1960 to 2007. And along the side are all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa with the year of diplomatic ties with China, Beijing. And so all of the areas of pink are diplomatic ties with Beijing. All of the areas of white are diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And so you can see this picture over time. So you can also see the times over here when China and when Beijing and Taiwan were having some diplomatic struggles, and some countries switched back to Taiwan. And all of the dark areas, the circles and the squares, are years of aid agreements of various kinds. And so what you can see here is that as diplomatic ties expanded, so did aid agreements. And so you can see that in the early years, actually the data is not as good. It really starts to get good around 1982. But from 1982, which is about in the middle, onward, we have aid agreements almost every year in almost every country. And so this shows how, even though aid from about 1978 to about 1981, there was very little going on because the Chinese were just going through their own. Deng Xiaoping was coming to power, Mao Zedong had died, and so they weren't sure what they were going to do about aid in Africa. But they resumed and they continued to be active. But nobody really saw this because it was still small scale. But that's when I went to Africa to study the Chinese there, and I saw all of this going on. Now, some people have heard about the Tanzan Railway. Well, this was their big flagship aid project from about 1966 to 1976 or so. It was constructed by tens of thousands of Chinese workers and tens of thousands of Zambian and Tanzanian workers. It was a huge project. But they did many other things. Now, this is a building that was built in the 1980s by Chinese aid in Sierra Leone. And I was there watching it be constructed. So it looks very new, doesn't it? You can see. It's new because there's this idea for an aid project that there's a kind of a lifetime guarantee. So when the war was over in Sierra Leone, Chinese construction company came to Sierra Leone and fixed the building and put up all new tiles because they had bullet holes in the old ones and made it look nice again. So there you see it, looking good. And you probably can't see this picture well, but the building is over here on one side, and on the other side is a stadium, also done by the Chinese in the 1980s. Now, China's engagement today in Africa comes out of the lessons that they learned through the 1980s and the 1990s. And so they have diversified their forms of cooperation. So it's not just aid, it's a lot of other things as well. Some of them are more business related. So they're building overseas economic zones in 6 countries. They are asking Chinese agribusinesses to partner with the aid program to run projects and to see whether or not they can become more sustainable if a Chinese company or research institute is involved. They've been giving resource-backed infrastructure loans, like the one we'll be talking about today. There's a $5 billion equity fund for Chinese investment in all different sectors, not just agriculture, as it's sometimes been described. And this is a map of Chinese presidents and premiers who've come to Africa since 1995. And what you can see here is they've come to most countries, and not just the resource-rich countries. So they've been visiting, they're going everywhere where China has diplomatic ties, because Taiwan is still active in 4 of those countries. And, but this got very little attention in the West until President Hu Jintao went in 2007. It's the first time the journalists really started to pay attention to the Chinese leaders going to Africa. But they've been going. Now, there are many things in the West that shock us about China's aid program. And it's really shocking to us that the Chinese aid, they can use their aid to build a presidential palace or a presidential residence in Sudan for the dictator there. And they pay for that out of the aid budget. And that's true. They do that, and they did that. And it shocks them that our aid experts can live in 5-star hotels and live better overseas than they do at home. And this is paid out of the aid budget. And here's a picture of how Chinese experts live in Africa and how Western experts live. So this is a Belgian aid worker here. And over here is a real residence for Chinese experts on a construction project. And these are engineers living in this container. So the second myth is that Chinese aid is huge. And I think this comes because many people just don't understand these various amounts of money coming from China. Now, the World Bank, for example, once published a report, and they said China had given Africa $44 billion in aid over the years. And I looked at that report, I said, this is too big. Where did they get this figure? So I saw they were reporting on a visit by Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao to North Africa. And in that visit, he had said, according to the newspaper article, that China had given $44 billion to Africa. So I said, it's not right. Maybe I can find another story. So I went to the Chinese press, and they also reported on this visit. And they said, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao said China had given Africa 44 billion renminbi. So that's about $5 or $6 billion. It's really quite a different figure. But that kind of mistake, the Boston Globe said China's giving 3 times the aid from the West. It's not true. I mean, no matter how you calculate these flows coming from China, they're not 3 times the aid from the West. In my own country, there are mistakes about Chinese aid because they have decided to, anything coming from the Chinese government, they just define as aid. This is really inappropriate. investment, export credits, other kinds of commercial bank loans. If they come from a state-owned company, they should count as aid. So the entire project in the Congo is aid. That doesn't make sense. If you use the same kinds of categories for China that we use in the West, Chinese aid is very small. It's about $1.2 billion in 2008. This is smaller than Japan, which is $1.6 billion, and much smaller than the aid coming from Europe. It has been growing rapidly, but by 2009, it was still at about $1.4 billion in disbursements. Commitments are higher because it's growing so quickly. Now, what we have here is pledges that the Chinese made at the end of 2006 at a huge conference in Beijing. They promised to do a number of different things in Africa over the next 3 years. Then they had another conference in 2009 in Egypt, and they made another set of pledges. But amongst these pledges, some of them relate to aid, but others relate to other forms of economic engagement or economic cooperation, which is what the Chinese say. So the ones in blue would be aid, official development assistance. And the ones in orange are other kinds of tools of engagement that the Chinese government has that most of our governments in the West don't have. So for example, they said they would double aid to Africa. This was official development assistance, grants, zero interest loans. They would set up a $5 billion fund, which I mentioned. That's not aid. They would give $3 billion in concessional loans. This is aid. And $2 billion in export credits, not aid. They would cancel debt, aid, train African professionals, build 30 hospitals and 30 malaria treatment centers and 100 schools. All of this is aid, official development assistance. They would open special economic zones and give tariff-free entry to African products. This is not aid. So all of these are all about development. But they're not all about aid. Now, what about these deals that we hear about, the one we're going to talk about today, or the one in Angola, which has now gotten to be almost $10 billion? These are huge, commodity-backed infrastructure credits. They're widely understood as aid, but the terms on which they're given make it quite clear that these are commercial deals. In the West, we think that if it finances development and it comes from a government, it must be aid, because that's how we think. In Africa, what our governments do is give aid. They're not trying to foster business as directly through our government instruments, since we've kind of given up on that in Africa. We're not trying to get our companies to transfer manufacturing to Africa the way the Chinese are. So these are market rate lines of credit. They are tied to Chinese goods and services because they're export credits from the export bank, the export-import bank. That's what export agencies, credit agencies do. They finance exports and services. And they're secured by commodities. So the commodities are a way to make sure the loan gets repaid in countries that don't have good credit ratings. It's the Japanese model that I talked about in the beginning, in which large lines of credit can be secured with commodities, and it's not necessarily always oil or copper. It can even be, in the case of Ghana, cocoa. Ethiopia, sesame seeds. Senegal, peanuts. So there are a lot of things that can be used. It's a way to secure the loan. It doesn't mean that China is desperate for Ghana's cocoa. And these are not concessional. So is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? In the West, we think any resources coming into Africa should be concessional because Africa is poor and Africa has a lot of debt and we've just forgiven the debt and canceled it. So now Africa should not get any more loans because they will then have too much debt. The Chinese have a different perspective. They say Africa has a lot that they can use to leverage more resources coming in and repay them if you structure the deal appropriately. So that's their perspective. Just the way Japan came to China in the late 1970s, China didn't have a credit rating. China could not borrow from Barclays. But Japan said, let's see how we can make a deal that can be good for Japan and good for China. Now we get technical, okay? So how many of you know what London interbank offered rate is? LIBOR. Have you heard of LIBOR? One person? Two people? Three? A few? Okay. Not very many people. Well, this is true of many journalists also. They don't know what LIBOR is. Well, the Chinese loans usually come in using London interbank offered rate. It's an interest rate that applies to short-term funds from one bank to another. But it's a worldwide interest rate. It's used in America, even though it's London. It's used around Europe, around the world. And so the Chinese loans will be at LIBOR plus a margin. So if this is getting too technical for you, I'm sorry, but it's important in order to understand these instruments. Now, let me give you two examples. Okay, these are two loans given to Angola by one China Exim Bank. They're both 2004. So in 2004, China Exim Bank gave $2 billion line of credit to Angola. The interest rate was at LIBOR, London Interbank Offered Rate, plus 1.5%. 12-year maturity and a grace period. It financed a number of different projects, so there was a grace period just till the end of each project. That same year, a group of banks from Europe, led by Standard Chartered, gave Angola a loan. $2.35 billion, even bigger. At LIBOR plus 2.5%, so 1 percentage point different. Repay 5 to 7 years and no grace period. Okay, so these are the two different terms. They're quite similar. The Chinese loan is a better terms than the Standard Chartered, but otherwise they're quite similar, and both loans are secured by oil. So Angola repays the Chinese with oil. Angola's oil also repays Standard Chartered. So they're very similar. And Angola has been getting these loans from the West for years. This is the first one from China. But everybody focused on the loan from China. Now, the loan from Standard Chartered Bank didn't finance anything in particular. It just went to the government, cash. The loan from China never went to the government in cash. It financed projects. And so we can see, here's a long list. I'm not going to go through them. But it did reconstruction after the war. And Chinese companies did most of this work, 70% at least. 30% was supposed to be done by Angolan firms. But it built health centers, it rebuilt roads, it did the water treatment system repairs. Electricity system in Luanda was repaired. Irrigation systems were built, and so on and so forth. So the Angolans got all of this development out of their oil. From the West, the banks, gave $2.35 billion. We don't know if it went to development at all. And meanwhile, the aid donors were trying to get Angola to improve its governance before they would give any aid. So that's the picture. The Western banks are still giving money, despite the governance problems in Angola, which are big. the Chinese banks start giving money and they start tying it to development. It's a different approach. And I don't think it's necessarily worse than what we do. Now, commodity-backed loans like this have risks in Angola or in the Congo. And some of the risks are, does the country get value for money? If you don't have international competitive bidding and tenders for projects, will they be offered at the right price? That's a risk. Who's going to select the projects? Do they go to the president's hometown? It's a risk. What about kickbacks to the government from Chinese companies for picking their project? It's a risk. Will the infrastructure be maintained? The Chinese aren't paying for maintenance. They're paying for construction. The government has to maintain it. Will they do that? Maybe not. Will the future resources be double mortgaged? Will they be tied to the Chinese loan and then also used for something else? It's possible. But there are also benefits. This money is less likely to be embezzled by governments because, as one African official said to me, with China, you never see the money. The money stays in China, it pays Chinese companies or exporters. And I argue that this system, this instrument, can be an agency of restraint. It can be in a country that appears to be cursed by its natural resources. This is a way to ensure that natural resources can be transformed into development directly. We don't have a way to do that. In some countries, this system can expand debt servicing capacity. In the Congo, the Chinese loan will open up new resources that Congo doesn't have today. In the future, those exports will be additional to what Congo has, and they will repay the loan. And so there will be more exports coming and more foreign exchange coming. And infrastructure doesn't have to wait for governance to improve. And I think this is a benefit to the people. The people of the Congo, the people of the DRC, they live in countries, and excuse me if I'm offending anybody, but they live in countries where governance is not always very good. Improving in many cases, but still a long way to go. And so, should they wait until governance gets to a point where Europe feels comfortable giving aid? Or should they get some roads, some electricity, some telecoms today and let governance improve? It's a question. Now, a few years ago, I was at a workshop at Oxford University, and the former president of Mozambique, President Chissano, was there. And he was complaining about the donors from Europe and America. And he said, there's a never-ending litany of seminars and workshops of doubtful value. And I'm sorry if some of you here have organized those. I also have. So he also said that the West has systematically dismissed African needs for infrastructure. They've ignored boosting the private sector. Now, I'm not sure this was fair, but that's what he said. That was his impression. And he wasn't talking about China. He was just talking about the West. Now, I think that our aid, we like to think that a big difference between the West and China is that the West insists on governance improvements, and our aid is conditional on governance, whereas China, no strings attached. So that's bad. That's the way we frame it usually. Now, what is it really in reality? Yes, our aid is performance-based. more and more. But all the performance is the responsibility of the recipient. They're the ones that have to do everything. We don't, the donors, we don't make ourselves responsible for performance of our aid. And our aid hasn't necessarily performed all that well. We talk about ownership, that ownership is a really important principle. But yet we still have a whole lot of conditionality. So how can you have ownership and conditionality? It doesn't work that well together. We talk about capacity building, but donors are still poaching or taking government officials from the ministries and bringing them into their projects. And so this weakens the government, and this happens over and over again. We talk about partnerships, but in reality, as you saw earlier in the pictures, our experts go to Africa and they live not like a partner, but they're living like a pasha. They're living like a prince. They're living not quite like King Leopold, but still. We live well as aid donors in Africa. And it's a little harder to be partners when you're up here and your partner is down there. And one more thing, we have a lot of investment going into Africa. And we forget about this when we're talking about the West. The West insists on good governance. China does not. But the West companies don't mind bad governance. So in America, our oil companies have been in Angola all through the war. They continue to partner with the government. But we're not stopping that because of bad governance. And in the DRC, there's also American and European investment, and so on, even in Zimbabwe. Now, as we talk today about China and Africa, I think it's useful to have a few things in mind as we frame this. And the first is counterfactual. So what would the situation be like if China was not present? So think in your mind, what would the situation be like in the DRC, in the Congo? What would the situation be like in Angola if China was not there? Or even Sudan or Zimbabwe. Take China out. Would the situation be different? It's a thought experiment. Second, what is the opportunity cost? So what is the next best available choice for African governments? If China is the choice they're making, what are they giving up? Is there something better that we can offer? Is there something better out there? If you take China away, what's their next best available choice? And then terminology, to be clear about it. Donors give aid, investors do investment. Export credit agencies give export credits to promote trade. The Chinese use a more general term for economic engagement. They talk about economic cooperation, but it encompasses all of these things. So to be careful that we're talking about apples and apples, not apples and oranges. And as we learned today about this deal in the Congo, I think it's important to get the facts right. So how different is this deal? And to compare it not to aid, because that's not the appropriate comparison, in my view. But to compare it to other kinds of mining deals that the DRC is making or has made in the past. And from that, what I want to learn more about is what kinds of joint venture shares are typical. Is the Chinese share lower or higher? What about the signing bonus? Is this typical or untypical? The financing, what do we know about that? The length of time of the deal, is this unusual or typical? The tax regime for the Chinese deal, is it special or not special? The degree of transparency, are the Chinese less transparent than other mining companies? What do we know? The price of the product, is it set by the market or not? The benefits and risks, how different are they compared to other kinds of deals? So I hope these things will become clear, because there's a lot that we don't know all that clearly about this deal. So in conclusion, let me say that why is China different in Africa? They are different. And they're different for 4 reasons. The first is their foreign policy framework is different, and I think we know about that. Non-interference in internal affairs is a key principle. Now, I come from America, and we don't have that principle in foreign policy in America. And we believe, in fact, our principle is we must interfere. Sometimes we must invade to improve governance, like in Iraq. So, but the second thing is that our core ideas about development are different. In the West, right now, development is about social policy, largely, and governance. But 10 years ago, development in Africa was all about structural adjustment and economic reforms. And then before that, it was about integrated rural development. I don't know if you remember those projects. So our recipe for development keeps changing. China is much more simple. They say, 要想富, 先修路, which means if you want to become wealthy, first build a road. It's pretty simple. And China has experience as being a recipient of loans and aid from abroad. So they're using this. And finally, China is in a region of East Asia, and they think alike. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, they think alike about development and about how the government uses instruments to foster development at home and uses those instruments abroad. We don't think like that in Europe or in America. So it's a challenge to us. In concluding, let me thank you again for this invitation to speak with you, to try to, I think, clarify some, at least of how I see, from my experience, how it works in Africa and how it works a little bit in China and a little bit how they're thinking about things. And I look forward to the greater detail today as we look at this deal in the Congo. Thank you.